So, what's the story behind the sci-fi classic, The Omega Man? Let's find out. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here, talking about movies, music, and monsters. Wow, guys, 50,000 subscribers in 8 weeks. There's just no way to show my appreciation other than to keep saying thank you, because without you, there'd be none of this. Thank you. Okay, I got to admit right off the bat that this one is definitely a guilty pleasure, but it's one of my personal favorites and I've just got to share it with you guys. I don't know, man, there was just something so cool about one guy alone in an entire city running around hunting monsters with a submachine gun. How cool is that? I remember reading Richard Matheson's book, I Am Legend, when I was probably around 8 years old. There was something about this book that really got to me as a kid. I vividly remember this one chapter in particular where he's out running around the city trying to collect all this stuff, and he keeps checking his watch to make sure it's running because he absolutely has to be in before dark. And I'll never forget the last terrifying words of that chapter. His watch had stopped. It was, of course, this classic sci-fi manuscript that eventually became The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston. But this book was also responsible for a ton of other stuff, so let's dig into that. American author Richard Matheson published I Am Legend in 1954. George Romero, who created the Living Dead series, was directly inspired from this novel. In fact, to quote George Romero directly, regarding Night of the Living Dead, I had written a short story which I basically had ripped off from a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. That is pretty wild. I mean, think about it. If it weren't for this book, would we ever have gotten zombies? Think about that the next time you're watching The Walking Dead. This is really cool. Everybody's pretty much familiar with all those great classic Hammer horror films. Well, they were even going to produce a film based on I Am Legend called Night Creatures. But that project, even for Hammer Films at the time, was considered too gruesome, so they scrapped the idea.
I was hired by Hammer Films to write a screenplay. It wasn't made, and the censors had really come down on them hard for both Frankenstein and Dracula. And when they got my script for I Am Legend, I think they changed the title to The Night Creatures. They said, oh no, not again. You're not going to make this.
Richard Matheson, the author, got his inspiration for this book from Mary Shelley's novel The Last Man, about one person with immunity surviving a plague-infested world. Mary Shelley, who knew? And, like all the movie adaptations that followed, our main character is Robert Neville, who in this book is trying to avoid being killed by these vampire creatures. Well, they're not actually vampires. He just considers them vampires because their condition is transmitted through bacteria in the blood. This book even won the Special Vampire Novel of the Century Award back in 2012 by the Horror Writers Association. This novel is just an incredible piece of work. If you ever get the opportunity to read it, dive in. I do have several versions of this book, but this particular copy is my favorite. It's autographed by Richard Matheson himself. Pretty cool. So then they took this book and made the movie Omega Man, right? Almost, not quite. In 1964, there was a version of this book that was made in Rome starring Vincent Price as Robert Neville called The Last Man on Earth. It's kind of cool. Richard Matheson, the guy who wrote the novel, actually worked on the screenplay for this film. But before the film actually made it to theaters, Richard Matheson was so dissatisfied with the final cut that he actually chose to be credited as Logan Swanson rather than Richard Matheson in the end credits. In the book, the night creatures were really fast, and they could climb and they could run, and it made them super creepy. But in this version, kind of like most zombie versions, they were very slow, very sluggish. This movie basically follows Robert Neville around almost beat per beat the way it was in the book. Right down to the final scene, which I won't spoil for anybody if you haven't read it or seen it. Luckily, this movie, The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, is now part of public domain, and I'm pretty sure you can watch the whole thing right here on YouTube. Do yourself a favor, watch it. And that, my friends, brings us finally to the Omega Man. One creature, caught in a place he cannot stir from in the dark, alone, outnumbered hundreds to one, and yet the whole family can't bring him down out of that honky paradise, brother. Oh, great, here we go. In 1971, we got the second film adaptation of I Am Legend, The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston, Anthony Zerbe, and Rosalind Cash. I remember seeing this as a kid on Channel 9 out of New York City, sitting alone at night at home in front of an old black and white TV, adjusting the aerial to try to get a clearer picture. This film seriously freaked me out. God, there's this one scene where Neville shoots the zombie thing out of the window and it goes tumbling down and impales itself on that flagpole. Then there's this close-up zoom-in shot right on the face and its eyes are staring at you and its mouth is open. I swear to God, I had nightmares about that scene for months, and probably still do. I was old enough to realize that the guy in the movie was the same guy from Planet of the Apes, and that made me love it even more. Charlton Heston. Now, this guy always played really big roles. He played Moses, he played Ben-Hur, then he played Taylor in Planet of the Apes. But at this point in history, and I'm not really sure why, he started doing a lot of these B-movie sci-fi flicks. And you gotta admire the guy for that. He just wanted to keep working. After The Omega Man, he went right into another sci-fi classic, Soylent Green. Video on that coming soon. The Omega Man was produced by Walter Seltzer, who later worked with Heston again in Soylent Green. As much as I love it, this version of the film, directed by Boris Sagal, was really different than the original novel. In this version, biological warfare, of course, is the cause of the plague that kills most of the population and turns who's left into these weird, nocturnal, albino mutants. Sort of interesting that the screenwriter, Joyce Corrington, felt it was more suitable to have biological warfare be the main cause because she herself had a doctorate in chemistry. Charlton Heston actually read the I Am Legend book on a flight returning to Los Angeles. He thought it would make an outstanding movie, along with maybe adding certain modern-day elements to the story. At the time, Heston had no idea that there had been a previous movie ever made about this with Vincent Price. And believe it or not, he tried to get Orson Welles to direct the film. How cool would that have been? But nothing became of that, so they got Boris Sagal, who had directed episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, and even Columbo. Pardon me, ma'am, just one more thing. Could you tell me if you've ever seen The Omega Man? Now, keep in mind, at this point, there was no such thing as CGI, so all of those incredible shots of the big empty city were actually shots of a big empty city. When they were scouting locations, they found out that there really weren't a lot of people downtown Los Angeles on the weekends shopping, surprisingly. So they filmed mostly weekends and early mornings in October and November of 1970. They claim that if you look really close, that you can see people moving around and cars going by in the background. Quite frankly, I've never spotted any of those. But if you have, let me know in the comments. This is so cool. The building that they built for Neville to live in was an actual set that was built right on the Warner Brothers Burbank studios, and it still exists today, and it still looks exactly the same. And you see that fountain sitting right in front of the building? Ever seen Friends? That's the fountain that you see in the opening of all the Friends TV shows. Personally, I always loved the psychological characteristics of Robert Neville. Playing chess with a bust of Julius Caesar, non-stop talking to himself and dead car dealers.
The fact of his solitary life, being alone. In the piece, he plays chess with himself, or in fact with a bust of Julius Caesar, which comes to the same thing, and we're never quite certain of the degree to which he is aware that he is making the moves on both sides. It's a difficult condition.
Really interesting to think about how that kind of a situation would have an impact on somebody's mental state. What's even more interesting is these were the things I was thinking about when I was 10 years old, which probably today explains a lot. And I hate to say it about such a classic sci-fi film, but man, did I love the one-liners. You're full of crap. There's never a cop around when you need one. And of course, my favorite, you are discarded. You are the refuse of the past. Oh man, do I love this film. Anthony Zerbe as Matthias. God, he was incredible. Now, the character of Lisa wasn't in the book, but actress Rosalind Cash did share one of the very first interracial kisses in Hollywood history with Charlton Heston. This was actually her very first leading role in a movie, and later in an interview she said, and I quote, "It's a spooky thing to screw Moses." Well, we'll just leave that right there, shall we? There was one scene that apparently was in the script and supposedly filmed where Lisa goes to see her parents' grave. The scene revolved around Lisa seeing a zombie mother burying a zombie baby. She lets them live and then goes back to see Robert Neville, who asked, "Did you kill them?" And she said, "No, I could never kill any type of a grieving mother, and I'm pregnant with your baby." Whew, pretty heavy stuff for 1971. But these days, Saturday morning cartoon stuff. Like I said, the scene was eventually cut, but the part of woman in cemetery crypt still appears in the ending credits. God, I would love to see that scene, but to my knowledge, it just doesn't exist. At the end of the film, Charlton Heston dies in this very biblical-style crucifixion pose. Sorry, spoiler alert. But that scene was, interestingly, never in the actual script. While they were filming that scene, Heston unintentionally kind of let his arms flow out into that position. The director saw it and thought, wow, not only is that a good idea, but it's a great focal point for the final scene of the film. Well, The Omega Man hit theaters in July 1971 and received fairly mixed reviews from the critics. God. Critics. I mean, it certainly wasn't a blockbuster, but it did bring in $300,000 in its first week and went on to earn over $4 million in the United States and Canada. Not too shabby for 1971. Believe it or not, it actually made more money than Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which came out only 1 month before The Omega Man and only made $3.4 million. Willy Wonka, Charlton Heston, The Omega Man wins. And what did Richard Matheson, the original I Am Legend author, think of The Omega Man? Well, he absolutely hated it, but said, it's okay because this story was so far removed from my original book that it don't bother me. When I watch the film today, the soundtrack is so 70s. Really makes me wonder how this film would have been different if the director had taken the George Lucas approach. When George Lucas made Star Wars, he specifically told John Williams that he didn't want the music to be dated. He wanted it to have more of a universal theme and sound, so they gave it a very traditional cinematic score. But you know what? It's cheesy, it's fun, and I love it. Kinda cool information about the soundtrack. The soundtrack was composed by Australian composer Ron Grainer. Who's Ron Grainer? Well, he's the guy who wrote the iconic theme for Doctor Who in 1963. Well, the Omega Man came and the Omega Man went, but that, my friends, was not the end of the film's impact on modern cinema. In the 1997 special, The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, we see an homage to this film called The Omega Man, with Homer Simpson playing out the role of Robert Neville in Springville. And for you music fans, this is really cool. Andy Summers wrote a song for The Police on their 1981 album Ghost in the Machine called Omega Man, which is based on the film. And this is so cool. That one scene of Robert Neville sitting in the movie theater watching the Woodstock film was the direct inspiration to the Mystery Science Theater 3000 TV show. And to top it all off, this was one of Tim Burton's all-time favorite personal films. Which, again, probably explains a lot, but that still wasn't the end of I Am Legend. In 2007, Warner Brothers released yet another adaptation of this post-apocalyptic action thriller starring Will Smith, but that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I really hope you guys enjoyed that retrospective on Charlton Heston's The Omega Man. And if you're new to this channel and you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing. I've got a ton of new videos on the way that I know you're just going to dig. As always, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and I promise to do my best to try to answer them for you. And please feel free to stop back anytime as we continue our conversation on movies, music, and monsters. Movies,
music, and monsters.